our final webinar of 2020, Maladaptive Daydreaming, an unrecognized disorder of dissociative absorption with Professor Eli Somer. Before I introduce Eli, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land from where I'm broadcasting this webinar, the Gabba-Danud of the Eastern Maar Nations, and to pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. I'm quickly going to run through a few housekeeping items. We have got technical support on board, so if you have any issues, please send a message to Melanie via the chat box and she will assist you. If your internet drops out for any reason, just click onto the link again and you'll be brought straight back into the webinar. And you'll receive a link to the recording of this webinar with your certificate of attendance within 48 hours. At the end of the presentation, Ellie's going to stop 10 minutes before the end. We'll have a Q&A session. So please make your questions as succinct as possible and pop them in the Q&A box, and then we'll go through those at the end. So now it is my great pleasure to introduce to you Professor Eli Somer for his first training with Delphi Training and Consulting. Eli is a clinical psychologist and clinical professor emeritus of psychology at the University of Haifa School of Social Work. He earned his bachelor's degree in psychology, sociology and anthropology and his master's degree in clinical psychology from the University of Haifa and his doctoral degree in counseling psychology at the University of Florida. Eli was the founder and scientific advisor of Trauma and Dissociation Israel, co-founder and past president of the European Society for Trauma and Dissociation, and past president of the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation. He's also been awarded several awards through the ISTD and is also a fellow of the association as well. Eli has been treating trauma survivors for over 30 years, first as a mental health officer in the Israel Defense Force and later as a civilian clinician for survivors of prolonged childhood trauma. He's published over 100 scientific publications in this field. In 2002, Eli identified a phenomenon of excessive absorptive daydreaming and coined its name maladaptive daydreaming. There have been over 35 scientific publications on maladaptive daydreaming since then. Eli is joining us today from Haifa in Israel, and we're very happy to have you speak with us today, Eli. So I'm now going to hand over to you. Thank you.
My pleasure. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here and to talk with colleagues at such a great distance. I was sharing with Naomi earlier how marvelous this technology is. So today I wish to introduce a psychological phenomenon that is gaining scientific and clinical interest, but still is relatively unknown, not only in professional circles, but also in academic circles. But still, the data that we produce is being published in respectable journals, and because these are peer-reviewed papers, we believe that the concept is gaining traction because we are demonstrating its validity and its usefulness. There's one group, I said that it's a fairly unknown phenomenon. There's one group of individuals who is very familiar with it, and these are the people who have been struggling with this problem. Some might actually be attending today's seminar here, and so welcome all. I have an ambitious outline today, so I have planned, I have here more slides than we could accommodate, but that's all right. You will be getting the more than, the essence of what is important to get a good notion of what is at stake here. So let's start. Daydreaming. Daydreaming in itself is a normal, prevalent mental health activity Almost everyone engages in it. As Singer, the pioneer researcher in the field, has determined 96% of presumably normal, well-educated Americans engage in daydreaming every day. Of course, what we will need to tackle here together is the definition of what is daydreaming. There's not a widespread agreement of what does it entail. This term is used loosely to refer to a wide variety of mental activities, including self-talk, thinking, and mind wandering, which is not the same, as I will explain later. So to add clarity, certainly more precise definitions are necessary. So let's look at daydreaming. Singer, again, the late pioneer in the field, determining that we are talking about episodes that are actually an internalized form of play. Singer and Klinger, these are the prominent scholars in the field, and they regarded daydreaming as sort of a lingering childhood activity that is, as Singer suggested, associated with playfulness, with play. And play is, of course, very important developmentally, but so what is the function of daydreaming? The research suggests that this self-generated mentation is actually interacting with the external experience. So if we look at the third bullet here, daydreaming has an adaptive role in the realm of, again, and in red you will see the interaction with reality, with planned preparation and rehearsal. So people would daydream about what sort of meal to prepare for dinner, and and would rehearse in their mind a conversation that they would like to have with their boss. Daydreaming is used for emotional regulation, so people would go over upsetting events that are they have endured to try to process it, or that they anticipate. It is used for motivation, so people sort of are projecting and imagining challenges ahead of them in order to practice mentally, and to learn from their success or their failure. So, in other words, daydreaming, as suggested here, it does not involve fantastic scenarios and elaborate inner worlds. But again, if we go back to daydreaming, this is about, again, paying attention inside while relating to the external world. We can see similar behavior across species. So, for example, if we take the example of the cheetah here, the cheetah cubs that are beneath the mother on the ground are very playful. They are in a sort of a daydreaming world, in a world of fantasy, where they practice hunting and they socialize. They are oblivious to the external reality. But the mother, on the other hand, stands at the top of the termite mound and is extremely grounded, observing the environment, looking up for potential predators in order to be ready to protect her cubs. So we see that as adults, it is not conducive to safety and survival to be oblivious to the external reality. You can afford to do that when you know that you're safe externally. So as adults, I presume that we are losing this innate ability that we have as children, or if we talk across species, the younger creatures are utilizing this mental ability in order to improve their adaptation to the external world. So this is a sort of a example of daydreaming and fantasy in the animal kingdom, and the importance of becoming more externally oriented as we grow up. When we talk about maladaptive daydreaming, again, I don't think this is simply a pathological manifestation of the kind of daydreaming that I have just defined, because maladaptive daydreaming is based on a trait that we could call immersive daydreaming. And immersive daydreaming, or absorptive daydreaming, is an extensive, absorptive, fanciful, fantastical, volitional, fantasy activity. I'm saying volitional because it's not just the mind wandering from one association to the other. This is about a storyline that has been developed inside, and it has little to do with the immediate external reality. It is frequently, and here's what another feature that sets it apart, it is frequently accompanied by stereotypical movements. And we don't understand the function of these movements. One of the video clips that I wish to show you later, you will hear the the person sharing her experience talk about the function of movement for her. But this may have to do with this physical stimulation may have to do with enhancing the immersion, but we are not sure about it. The fantasy is often enhanced while listening to evocative music. So people almost universally tell us that music is very important for them to trigger this fantasy and to maintain it. Again, it makes the experience more real for them. Perhaps it acts like a musical score in a movie to evoke emotions. But we don't really know. It can also serve a goal of a kind of a stimulation that improves and deepens the, if you will, semi-hypnotic state of absorption inwardly into the fantasy. But so this is immersive daydreaming. Immersive daydreaming in itself is not pathological. As I said, this is a trait. I presume it is innate. So some children have a more intense or a better capacity for this kind of daydreaming. I don't have this ability, unfortunately, because it seems like it's a lot of fun. But this ability can go awry because it is experienced as very rewarding. So when something is extremely rewarding, and when the reward circuits in the brain are activated, there is a risk of, I would say, an addiction developing. So when immersive daydreaming evolves into a compulsion or an addiction, and when it creates distress and it interferes with some important daily responsibilities, then we have the hallmarks of a psychopathology. I mean, these are exactly the criteria that are used by the DSM to define a disorder. In the DSM, they would outline the symptoms, and you would sometimes have to have a certain number, a minimum number of symptoms out of a given list in order to qualify. But these symptoms are not enough. there's always a condition that these symptoms should create distress or impair some important area of functioning. So when immersive daydreaming becomes so compulsive, gets out of control, and people prefer to live in their inner world at the expense of paying attention to their responsibilities, then we're talking about a problem. We and here we have, again, as I'm trying to define what is maladaptive daydreaming. The scale that we have developed is highly correlated with the dissociative experiences scale, particularly with the absorption factor. As time permits, I will show you some data. So this is a partially clinical and partially scientific academic presentation. And you should also know that maladaptive daydreaming is highly comorbid with several DSM psychopathologies. This is not unusual. Almost all categories or disorders in DSM are correlated or comorbid with others. In our case, attention deficit disorder, the inattentive type, is extremely comorbid, like in the range of 77% or so. But not the other way around, by the way. Not all people with attention deficit have maladaptive daydreaming, but maladaptive daydreaming is apparently, and as you would expect perhaps, it impedes the ability to be attentive to outside demands, attention demands. It is also comorbid with obsessive compulsive disorder, with depression and anxiety. We will elaborate on it as time permits. But to introduce you better to this experience, let's listen to a testimony of what is it like.
Jane, tell me about maladaptive daydreaming.
Well, that started as early as I could remember. I think from really young childhood, I would play school like all kids do. But if I didn't have any friends over, I'd play it in my head and I would be the teacher. And I would imagine like all the kids in the class had different powers. Some could fly. And I could play this for hours. And I would twirl around in circles and kind of do this with my hands. And grown-ups would ask what I was doing. And I'd be like, oh, I'm just playing school in my head. And then around 7 or 8, I started changing it from school to be episodes of my favorite TV show. So I would like watch the Brady Bunch in my head, but it would be different episodes. I would change it. Sometimes I would be an actress in the show. Sometimes I'd be another character on the show. Sometimes I wouldn't be in it at all, but I would just change the plots and write new ones.
So, by the way, as you're listening to Jane, and I will continue this in a second, I just would like to draw your attention to the fact that when people with maladaptive daydreaming report to the psychiatrist that they have these elaborate fantasies in their mind, some of them diagnose them as schizophrenic, and you need to judge for yourself to what extent does Jane look like schizophrenic. She doesn't look like one to me. She is very animated. She has a lot of rich emotional expression, and she's very coherent, no thought disturbances, and so on and so forth. And that seems to distinguish well between fantasy and reality.
All watching the Brady Bunch on TV, just the same reruns over and over again, so I wanted to watch new ones. And I did that with like all the shows of my childhood: Little House on the Prairie, Brady Bunch, 8 is Enough, Facts of Life. And often, sometimes I would, again, pace around in circles. Didn't really think it was a problem because I was only doing it when I was bored and didn't have a friend to play with and there was nothing else to do. But a big shift happened around junior high school, because that's when I learned how to do it without spinning in circles, and I could actually daydream just sitting still. So I started doing it in school. Around 7th grade, I started watching General Hospital. It's the age of Luke and Laura. And I would be sitting in pre-algebra class, and I'd be watching General Hospital in my head. And then it became a little more of a problem because unlike before when I had to spin in circles and I only did it in select periods, I started doing it over and over and over, and I felt like it was becoming compulsive. By high school, I mean, I was still a very good student because I could force myself to study, but in class, I had no idea what was going on. But the night before the test, I would teach myself the textbook. But I just started to feel like I'd go out with friends and I'd be half listening to my friends and half creating stories in my head. And I started feeling like I preferred my daydreams to real life. So I had kept them.
So she starts talking about the impairment of how the immersive daydreaming is developing into a maladaptation.
Secret for a while. And in high school, I told my parents and tried to get help, but everybody just laughed at me and said everybody daydreams. My parents did take me to a few mental health professionals. No one really thought that there was anything wrong with it. They told me to just keep daydreaming, so I did, and I did it all the way through law school. And again, I can't really say it hurt my life, but I was just exhausted because I was trying to keep up with the real world and try to keep up with all the characters in my head.
So undoubtedly a very high functioning maladaptive daydreaming with some impairment in social life and some distress, but otherwise very well functioning.
And I never ever thought, like I knew they were daydreams. I knew they were just not reality. I never
So not psychotic?
Reality and fiction, but I just felt it became exhausting. And I kept trying my whole life, trying to find someone who daydreamed like me, and I could never, no one knew what I was talking about. Like everybody kept telling me everybody daydreams, but when I talked to them about like the detail and the hours and the plots, doctors just looked at me like I've never heard of such a thing. So finally, after I graduated law school, I found a doctor who was like, I've never heard of this, but if it's bothering you, there's a lot of OCD in your family. So he put me on an SSRI. Examples of SSRIs are Paxil, Prozac. But he put me on fluvoxamine, which is one that's used more typically with people with OCD. And it was like magic. Within 6 weeks, all my characters disappeared. And I eventually...
Okay, just to qualify here, this was published, by the way, as a single case study. It has not been repeated, and no controlled studies have been done on medications. Together with Dr. Colin Ross, we conducted a survey of people with maladaptive daydreaming, trying to assess their reaction to various prescribed medications, prescribed to them for the condition, and recreational drugs. And we found no particular drug is really effective, with some slight effect for SSRIs. But our conclusion was that this is not a kind of a disorder that would respond very significantly to medications, unless there is, of course, a comorbidity, and in this case, possibly a comorbidity with OCD, as I've earlier indicated, which is the case in some instances.
Weaned down on the dose so that I still was able to daydream, but the difference was I was in control of it. And I could give a really good example. There was, I used to hate it. I live in New York City and I walked to the subways, and I would always daydream, and I used to hate it when someone would try to walk with me. But once I was on the Luvox, I remember waiting around for a colleague to go with me because I wanted the company. So I started to appreciate the company of real people. And then I kind of forgot about daydreaming. That was around age 29 or so. And I just was not a problem in my life anymore. And then a friend called me up and told me that her daughter was spinning in circles, and she's someone who used to babysit me when I was little. And she was like, Jane, I think that my daughter's doing exactly what you're doing. So all of a sudden, I went on the internet, because there was no internet when I was going through this. And let me tell you, I spent like years going through psychology databases, my parents' library, trying to find something on this daydreaming topic. And there was nothing. But now that there was the internet, I started to do research for my friend's daughter. And I found this kind of obscure article. It was on an Indian parenting website about a little girl who daydreamed too much, didn't pay attention in class. The article itself didn't seem very relevant, but when I saw the comments, my jaw dropped. It was like post after post of people exactly like me. Many of them spun in circles, all loved their daydream worlds, but they felt like they were compulsive and addictive. It was amazing. So I convinced my psychiatrist to write me up as a case study. And that time I was really embarrassed about this whole thing. So I was anonymous. I was patient X. And then though, my psychiatrist actually convinced his friend, a researcher, to write it up. And she got all of this feedback from people reaching out to her, and she would forward them to me. And later, that's when I decided to go back to school to study psychology. And the co-researcher, the person who wrote my case study, had been hearing from hundreds of people from around the world. And we started to do research on the topic. And eventually I ended up working on 3 peer-reviewed empirical articles, and it's now called maladaptive daydreaming disorder. So I'm really proud of the fact today that if a college student were to look at a database like I did in college, I came up empty-handed, but they're now gonna come up with the articles that I helped write and my case study, and there's a whole line of literature on there about maladaptive daydreaming. And then I did go public with my story in an article in The Atlantic about my maladaptive daydreaming experiences, and I continue to hear from people from all over the world who are either worried about themselves in the daydreaming or they're worried about their children in the daydreaming. And I try the best I can to get back to every one of them.
Jane, tell me.
Okay, so but as I said, unlike any other mental conditions that can flare up at any part of your life, depression, anxiety, all sorts of clinical conditions can appear de novo at age 20, 30, 40, 50, and so on. And this one is sort of developmental in the sense that we can almost invariably identify its and based on people's accounts, yes, it begins in childhood, and even if it is related to distress and to emotional regulation, the ability predates any significant stressors. So here is an example. This is something that I picked from YouTube, and YouTube is public domain, so I'm not infringing on anybody's privacy. So these are parents talking to their child, interviewing them, to my mind, with too many closed questions requiring yes and no answers, but she's quite eloquent about describing her inner world. So take a listen.
Hey, Katie. Who is Carlos?
He's my best friend and he's my brother.
Okay. Carlos, where's Carlos at right now?
He's right beside me.
Right beside you. Okay. And you played with Carlos at school?
Yes.
And does Carlos play with your friends at school?
Yes.
Can they see Carlos?
Yes.
And then Carlos goes home with his mommy and daddy at the end of school?
They come with you and Mama.
Okay, so when we was at Buffalo Wild Wings the other day, as a family, Carlos was there?
Yes. He was.
He rode in the car with us. He got out the car, and then he sat down at the table with us at Buffalo Wild Wings.
Yes, he did. He did.
Okay, what is Carlos doing right now?
He's playing around me.
How old is Carlos?
3 like me.
Okay.
How did you meet Carlos?
I went at school and meet Carlos.
So you met Carlos at school?
Yes.
So Carlos came from school
Yes.
to the house with you?
Well, apparently the parents are not, I mean, this, to a very, very naive ear, this may sound like psychotic hallucinations, but again, obviously, looking at the child, she seems so animated, cute, and so much devoid of any negative psychotic symptoms. And the parents also, of course, they would not, I guess, post a video to shame their daughter, they think it's cute because she's essentially talking about her imaginary friend, which to my mind is the precursor or the childhood version of maladaptive daydreaming, or rather of immersive daydreaming.
Katie.
Okay, so the next video was provided with permission by parents. The child is now much older, so he's unrecognizable, and you don't know where this was taken. But again, this was provided with permission to be shared with professionals. So don't distribute, of course, images of this. But what you would see is, again, a behavior that might appear as something else. But this boy reports that he is daydreaming during these movements. So he looks a little autistic. He looks, but on the other hand, also there's something normal about children displaying this compulsive behavior of walking on lines or not stepping on cracks and so on and so forth. But this child spends hours every day doing this kind of behavior. And when asked about his activity, he reports that he has a very rich internal life and he doesn't want to be disturbed while doing that. So, and you can also note the dual awareness of this child. He is both absorbed internally, but he's also navigating the designs on this pavement, so he's aware of where he is, but seemingly lost in his own world. And there's also mouthing. He's talking. He's saying things that apparently are related to what is going on inside. So let's take a brief tour of the history of maladaptive daydreaming. The construct was coined in 2002. So as some of you, as you know, by the introduction by Naomi, I'm a scientist practitioner. I've all my life I've been seeing patients, but I'm also doing research, and I specialize in trauma-related and dissociative disorders. So my initial observations of maladaptive daydreaming were made in my trauma practice. So as expected, the patients who displayed maladaptive daydreaming also reported significant trauma history. So if you look at this table here you have history of aversive childhood experiences, and so and this little paper, by the way, was just an extended case study. I noticed in my clinic that one of my clients, just to give you an example of how it's all started, and also, incidentally, this is a story of how important clinical practice is, because our knowledge is not born in the university labs or by pushing pencil and paper questionnaires. The knowledge about mental health is born in the clinics, and it needs to be brought bottom up. So, but this was a side note. So one of my clients reported that he was full of rage. This is a man in his early 30s who was emotionally abused and tormented and criticized and mocked by his father primarily. and he was full of rage. He had temper tantrums, and but these he was, of course, unable to express and release the kind of anger that he contained within himself. So he used to spend hours every day twirling a pen in his head, imagining that he sets off nuclear bombs over cities and huge battlefields and so on. But spends hours doing so, because I was inquiring about his general vocational dysfunction, and so I became attuned to this, and in my cohort at the time, spanning over a period of 3 months, I discovered 6 such patients. I think it was an unusual conglomeration of people with disorder in my practice, because currently I don't have that many or that proportion of patients. But others were having imaginary families that they were interacting with, imagining idealized versions of themselves, and so on. But in terms of their trauma history, you see moderate, severe, severe, moderate, moderate, severe. They will all survivors of some form of childhood trauma or neglect. But it was a wrong conclusion that I put in that paper, because I concluded that this is a dissociative, trauma-related dissociative disorder of escapism into fantasy. The only thing I was wrong about, that this is exclusively trauma-related, and this. Of course, this was not a controlled study. It was a extended case study, and it was a speculation, but it was accepted as such. At any rate, this paper did not have a great impact. People didn't quote it much. I didn't receive much feedback on it. So no impact on the scientific community, where it really mattered to me as an academic at the time. And I dropped the research on this. I continued to do my research on dissociative disorders. However, we are at the age of the internet, and people with this condition, like Jane, Jane described in her experience, were Googling desperately keywords that could describe their condition. Of course, they didn't use the term maladaptive. They used compulsive daydreaming, pathological daydreaming, daydreaming disorder. Lo and behold, many of them identified this little paper that was published in a, I would say, second grade, or I would say not the top notch, but clinical paper was. But they discovered it, and the term became viral among in this community. It's not the best term, but I was reluctant to call it a disorder out of respect to the people that have it. I didn't have enough evidence. And also, I was reluctant to pathologize what seemed to be a normal mental behavior. So I called it maladaptive. It's an awkward word. In many words, there's not even in many languages, there's not even a translation to maladaptive daydreaming. But the term caught, and a bottom-up campaign to medicalize maladaptive daydreaming began. First of all, if you put maladaptive daydreaming with asterisks, sort of forcing Google to search exactly that term, you can come up with close to 400,000 results. And of course, in before 2002, there would have been 0 results. So this tells you how popular the term has become, but not among professionals, because professionals obviously hear about it for the first time when they are presented with evidence or information about it. I described this bottom-up process in a paper that was published 2 years ago. And the paper was actually describing the discourse of the maladaptive daydreaming community out there with me initially. Now there are more researchers studying this disorder. So for years, not a week goes by without my receiving multiple inquiries and information and requests for information and appeals to continue to do my research on it, because allegedly that they are being misunderstood. So here are some examples, and I will not read all of them, but hello, my name is so and so, and I've had this disorder for as long as I can remember. Up until a year ago, I thought I was the only person that excessively daydreamed. I've read about you and your research about this, and I saw a video of you on the Wild Minds website. If you still are interested in interviewing people about maladaptive daydreaming, I think I could be very helpful. So the community has mobilized itself to first to push me and encourage me to resume my research activity in the field, which I've dropped because of lack of interest. But they offered me something that I could not refuse. They offered me something very precious. They offered me themselves as participants in these studies, and this is a very, very precious resource. Those of you out there who are conducting research with clinical communities know how difficult it is to get a sample of individuals with dissociative amnesia, or a sample of individuals with dissociative identity disorder. It's extremely difficult for a variety of reasons. People are bashful, are concerned about their privacy, but they don't want to be, they don't want to expose anything about themselves. There's issues of distrust, there's overprotectiveness of the therapist, and so on and so forth. Let me tell you that I have a personal list of individuals who wrote to me volunteering for research that has over 1,200 names with emails of people waiting, a waiting list to be included in these studies. And all I need to do is post a call for participants on any of the online communities, and I could get, it's not about me, we could get hundreds of participants of self-identified individuals with maladaptive daydreaming in a few days, which is remarkable and has helped tremendously in advancing research in the field. So the internet community started to mushroom in all languages. I can only search in 1 or 2 languages, but when I use Google Translate to try to find equivalent terms in other languages, there are websites and online resources and community in many other languages. And this is quite amazing for a disorder that has not been recognized as officially as a clinical syndrome. And maybe it is because of that people are seeking peer support and advice, because they cannot find help out there. There are countless of Facebook groups in English. There are, I think, about 10, but also in many other languages. Listservs, support groups, Reddit. I don't know if you're familiar with Reddit. Reddit has a maladaptive daydreaming community with, mind you, over 45,000 participants. This is absolutely jaw-dropping. YouTube testimonies. People who are brave enough, courageous enough to put on their testimonials online. They do it. They do it because YouTube is also a social network. They want a feedback. They want to interact with people who respond to them, but they also are doing a great service to the cause, the greater cause. The construct is sort of sexy in a sense. Maybe it's an inappropriate word to use, but for the media, because it's an interesting mental health condition, and the construct has drawn significant international media attention. Here you can see a BBC World story featuring me talking about it, but there are many other examples of media coverage. All you need to you go to our research website. It's a free Wix account, so the domain is a little awkward. But if you Google maladaptive daydreaming research, I think certainly on the first page, if not the first hit, would be our research website. And so this is just an example of the stories and the platforms that were interested in doing a story. New York Magazine, U.S. News and World Report, the Jerusalem Post, and so on and so forth. But what is most important is that research is booming. Again, if you go on our website, our research website, all the known research in this emerging field is listed, and the papers are downloadable for you to read. We're trying to make this information free and available to all, and often when individuals write to me about not being understood by their doctors, I am suggesting that they refer them to our research website so they could read some of the literature. What is most encouraging to me is that we're also getting increasing number of requests for assistance in conducting graduate research projects from students across the globe, both by, of course, students that we are supervising, but also by students from other places. ICMDR is the International Consortium for Maladaptive Daydreaming Research. A few words about measurement. Of course, the scientific standing of maladaptive daydreaming is based on the ability to establish that this is a reliable construct that can be reliably measured, and it is valid, that it measures what it is proposed to be measuring, and it is stable temporally across time and across cultures. This is something that is a sort of a foundation of an emerging mental disorder. And indeed, we have developed such a measure, the maladaptive daydreaming scale. It is now has been evolved into the latest version is the 16-item maladaptive daydreaming scale. And I can confidently tell you that our research is based on solid measures with good validity, internal consistency, and that the measure discriminates very well between self-identified individuals with and without maladaptive daydreaming. So it is a very sensitive instrument and specifically identifies these conditions. So it seems like an excellent measure for future study of maladaptive daydreaming. Astonishingly, the instrument has been translated into 37 languages. How has that happened? I don't know that there is any other measure that has gained so much interest across cultures. But the reason for that, and I don't know that it has been scientifically used in these 37 languages, but this is an example of the grassroots movement of maladaptive daydreaming, because the instrument has so many translations to a great degree, thanks to the interest of consumers from various cultures who express their interest voluntarily. They have approached us to promote maladaptive daydreaming knowledge in their own communities. So I know we were very careful about instructing them on how to translate and back translate into English, and have the back translated version compared to the original version for consistency. So most of these, if not all of these, are very good translations, and there are also validation studies, actual peer-reviewed validation studies of several such versions. That show that it is a useful construct and is consistently stable across cultures. We even did a cross-cultural study to show that the urge to be absorbed in daydreaming, comforting, and its addictive properties may have different meanings across cultures. We found that the interference of maladaptive daydreaming to daily life is a central defining factor with equivalence in American, British, Italian, and Turkish samples. This is a study conducted on over 1,000 participants. We also developed a DSM-style diagnostic criteria for a future nosology of daydreaming disorder. Again, if this ever gets into the DSM, it should be called, I guess, either daydreaming disorder or dissociative absorption disorder. So we propose that to be diagnosed with maladaptive daydreaming, one should have the trait of immersive or absorptive daydreaming as described in criterion A and A1. That also needs to be present as a condition. So A would be persistent and recurrent fantasy activity that is vivid and fanciful, as indicated by the individual exhibiting 2 or more of the following in a 6-month period. At least one of these should be criteria 1. So criteria 1 is while daydreaming experiences an intense sense of absorption, immersion, that includes visual, auditory, or affective properties. And then we listed a few more typical criteria, and at least one of them needs to be present. And as is the case in other DSM disorders, criterion B is a must. So criterion A would be immersive daydreaming. That in itself is not psychopathological, but here comes B. The disturbance causes clinically significant distress or impairment, and so on. So this must be present. And C, one should rule out that it is not better explained by any other condition, including not use of drugs, and so on and so forth. We also developed these suggested diagnostic criteria into a clinician-administered diagnostic interview. This is the gold standard in psychodiagnostics. And Naomi Halpern, the host of this program, was a co-researcher in this project. We indeed believe that these are important steps towards including the maladaptive daydreaming disorder into the next, or one of the next editions of the DSM. What we did in this study that Naomi participated in, Naomi and I blindly received individuals to be interviewed, not knowing if they are if their MDS-16 score indicates suspected maladaptive daydreaming or not. And the inter-rater agreement that we reached was very high. So this is just, never mind what Cohen Kappa means, but Cohen Kappa is sort of a measure of inter-rater agreement. And for the DSM, Five nosologies had kappa values of 0.6 to 0.79. 9 had this kind of range of kappa values. 6 had this kind of, and they're all in. And 3 had values of less than 0.2, and the coin kappa values for maladaptive daydreaming was very high, very high. So the news are encouraging. We are also developing several other measures for maladaptive daydreaming, and they are in different stages of development. The recent changes of public interest in maladaptive daydreaming, I think, over time can be gauged by a comparison of Google search trends. So I've compared in this slide, I've compared maladaptive daydreaming searches on Google, the searches for this term, with searches for similar mental behaviors like fantasizing is the red line, and mind wandering, which is the yellow line down here, and also dissociative identity disorder, which is a well-established condition. And maladaptive daydreaming is in blue, so you can see that it has always been above, more searched. This is since 2015, more frequently searched than the terms fantasizing and mind wandering. But look what is happening recently. The interest, as reflected in Google searches and Google Trends, is now equivalent, or maybe even slightly exceeds the search trends for dissociative identity disorder. So in terms of our standing in the world's public opinion, we're there, we're on the map. So what are some related constructs? I mean, there's the field of consciousness research is a little blurry, and the clinical field of treating consciousness-related disorders is also not very well defined and studied. So. But we believe that maladaptive daydreaming represents a unique, distinct condition, and that, of course, needs to be demonstrated. So let's quickly compare and contrast maladaptive daydreaming with existing related constructs. So a construct that has some overlap with daydreaming is the fantasy-prone personality. It is the closest construct. It is, by the way, the last bullet here is that we used the measure of fantasy proneness as the external validation criteria for our newly developed measure. So individuals with fantasy-prone personality are said to be well-adjusted individuals who tend to live in a world of imagery and fantasy. But pay attention to the words colored in red, because they stand for the distinctiveness of fantasy proneness that sets it apart from maladaptive daydreaming. So fantasy-prone individuals are hypnotizable. And we don't have any evidence that this is the case for maladaptive daydreaming. They're encouraged to fantasize as a child. We don't have any evidence for that in our case. They have report mystical paranormal experiences that, again, sets it apart from maladaptive daydreaming. And they have healing powers, so do they believe. So it's a kind of a mixed bag of symptoms that only part of them are associated with our construct, that again is associated also with, as I said, with movement and is attraction to music. But what is noteworthy is that Rauschenberger and Lin assessed that 6% of the population are fantasy prone. So this propensity for extensive fantasizing certainly does not seem to be a rare phenomenon. mind wandering. Again, unlike daydreaming, mind wandering is seen as the mind's idle mode. So here, the bullets here suggest different attempts to define it. So it's a mentation decoupled from external tasks and immediate sensory perceptions, meaning that it's not focused on what needs to be done out there externally. Ubiquitous psychological baseline from which people venture when attention is demanded. So what actually this awkward wording says, that this is the idle mode of the mind. This is the baseline and the default state of the mind when it is not engaged, when the attention is not demanded externally. Another way to look at it is a motley of reminiscence, brief reflection, and anticipation of future moment. Again, you see that mind wandering relates to real life. It is thought of as an attentional failure or a periodic breakdown of attentional control. That's another way of looking at it. Although the more normalized approach is that is the idle mode of the brain. Okay, so the ontological quandary here, ontology meaning what is this, what is it about, is how is maladaptive daydreaming related to mind wandering? Because you will hear a lot of mind wandering and consciousness researchers talk interchangeably about daydreaming and mind wandering as if they were the same thing. And I don't think they are identical. Definitely not. Mind, as I try to convince you, maladaptive daydreaming is an internal storytelling, is an internal direction of a script. It's developing a creative development of internal worlds and scenarios. This is not an idle mind. This is not a resting mind. This is a mental activity requiring interest, attention, internal sensory engagement, but subjective. I mean, I'm wondering if brain areas associated with vision and hearing are being fired up when this mental activity is occurring. And certainly, mind wandering is not associated with this purposeful stereotypical movement. So it is not task negative. Here's an illustration of maladaptive daydreaming divergence from mind wandering. Let's go to what is underlined. Again, this is one of the countless of contacts that I'm receiving from consumers out there. I also experience the craving and the compulsion. However, I find that maladaptive daydreaming requires a huge amount of mental energy, which I don't have. As I feel a compulsion to daydream, I feel that I'm missing the fuel for it. So this is an energy, a mental energy consuming behavior, clearly not a mind at rest. Okay, so it's not mind wandering. As I said earlier, mind wandering is associated with the activation of certain cortical areas that light up during the mind wandering, and they're called default network. These mechanisms, again, they interact with reality, they relate to reality, not to fantasy, and they address the person's past and future, but these activities are not described as fanciful. So the question is, and it remains to be investigated with brain scanning, is the default mode network activated during maladaptive daydreaming? If it is, it would be a form of mind wandering. I doubt that it would. I don't think that the default mode network would be activated during maladaptive daydreaming, but that remains to be researched. Sluggish cognitive tempo is another. I really, frankly, had never heard of it before I started focusing on maladaptive daydreaming. It is a rather derogatory term used to define a syndrome described as including two symptom clusters. One cluster pertains to what we're interested in. It's being lost in thoughts or daydreaming. So there's a potential overlap there with fantasy proneness and maladaptive daydreaming. But sluggish cognitive tempo also has a physical and a mental slowness and fatigue a feature not present in daydreaming or in maladaptive daydreaming. In other words, sluggish cognitive tempo shares some features with maladaptive daydreaming, but certainly is a different condition. Okay, so we covered that. So consistent reporting, as I told you, by maladaptive daydreaming are posted online and on countless online communities indicate that this condition stems from childhood. And furthermore, inquiries that I've received from pediatric psychoneurologists, both in Canada and the United Kingdom, suggest that there's a group of children, based on their experience, that are seen in developmental neurology and TIC clinics, that display a unique pattern of behaviors. If you remember this boy, it really looks like a tick behavior that resembles the kind of movement by autistic spectrum disorder children with autism. But what is noteworthy is that these children report having a fantasy or fantasizing, daydreaming while they have this stereotypical movement. So the childhood antecedents of maladaptive daydreaming may have been there out in plain sight as a different DSM nosology. So here's, for example, one study easily missed. Let me go to the result of this paper published in Developmental Medicine and Child Neurology a few years back. And they say here, children, but not their parents, like their movements, which were usually associated with excitement or imaginary play. Imaginary play. So here you have this movement that is so enigmatic, this element of stereotypical movement, identified as the main disorder in children. And the secondary one, almost as a footnote, is the imagination. This very similar condition, if not identical, has been described with a different nomenclature of what seems to be a very similar condition. This was described by a group out of London, UK, Intense Imagery Movement, and they have published two papers on this, describing this inexplicable connection between movement and imagery. Again, these are children seen in London in a tic disorder clinic. So what is the relationship of maladaptive daydreaming to these two disorders, which might actually be the same? Could this be the etiological pathway leading to maladaptive daydreaming? We don't know that. And I've been trying to engage the clinicians in these two clinics in Canada and London to at least write up some case studies, but they're very busy. And but I hope they will do it, because I talked to both teams and they're keenly interested. Imaginary friends. Remember this cute little girl that we saw at the beginning of this seminar? Imaginary friends or pretend friends or invisible friends are such a prevalent phenomenon among children. So they seem very real to the children themselves. The children understand that their imaginary friends are not real. And this could be, again, this whole issue of psychopathology, we need to regard it as dimensional, not categorical. It's not like either you have it or you don't. There is a dimension ranging, yes, from apprehension to severe anxiety, from a dejected mood to major depression, and and the capacity of the mind to dissociate not only structurally as in DAD, but also to not only to dissociate from memory, as would be in the case in dissociative amnesia, not only the capacity to dissociate the perception from oneself as in the realization, depersonalization, but apparently there is also an ability for normal absorption, which until now has been considered by some leading theoreticians in our field as non-related to dissociative disorders, absorption. Apparently, I think we are providing a strong case for it also being a dimensional construct ranging from normal absorption, like one would be absorbed in a book or in a movie, to a pathological form of absorption. And on the normal end of the spectrum, you would have imaginary friends. Okay, so another term of interest is the term paracosms. It's just a term used. The consumers use it. It relates to the inner imaginary world. But mind you, this term has been out there. Is not part of the psychopathology field, but it's there and it's relevant. So in terms of comorbidity, as I told you, and then trying to decipher what are we talking about? What is this new condition? There's a 77% comorbidity, as I told you, with attention deficit and hyperactivity inattentive type and maladaptive daydreaming. We also measured maladaptive daydreaming among people with ADHD, and we found only about 25% comorbidity, which is high, but certainly not 77%. So we're not talking about the same disorder. They have some overlap, but they're clearly not identical. So we believe that maladaptive daydreaming simply consumes a big chunk of the attention resources. They are concentrated inwardly, and it is at the expense of being attentive to what is going on externally. Right now we're arguing in the paper that we're writing up that some portion, a subgroup of people with ADHD and attentive type who are not perhaps responding well to the regular treatment might actually be maladaptive dreamers, and that disorder should be addressed. Are some forms of maladaptive daydreaming, is it a mental compulsion, and are they part of the, there's a spelling error here, obsessive compulsive. So are we talking about an OCD spectrum disorder? As Jane has testified earlier in this seminar, her case was, probably an overlap of maladaptive daydreaming. So people who can have both, of course, the capacity for immersive daydreaming and the obsessive compulsive urge to get it just right, or to repeat it over and over again until it is perfect, or whatever compels individuals to repeat their action. But I would only say, or add to this, that these addictions in generally, and behavioral addictions in particular, are of course associated with habits and with compulsions. But this remains an open question. Is there at least a subtype or a pathway leading to maladaptive daydreaming that goes through OCD spectrum disorders? Obviously, OCD medication doesn't help everyone, so there are different trajectories leading to maladaptive daydreaming. So this is the case study that Jane was talking about. She's not a co-author, but she revealed that she is the case described here. And this is the side note on maladaptive daydreaming and medication. This is a study that I conducted with, as you see here, with Colin Ross and Melina West, who is, by the way, an Australian postdoctoral resident. And we surveyed individuals self-diagnosed with maladaptive daydreaming, and they reported to the use of recreational drugs. And we don't have, most of the participants reported little or no effect of drugs or medications on daydreaming. Although tentative recommendations can be made in favor of prescribing antidepressant against the use of marijuana, which is, by the way, exacerbates the daydreaming for individuals with maladaptive daydreaming. So the root here is psychotherapy. So many sufferers describe this as a behavioral addiction. As I said, it's in their own words. Let's hear somebody who alludes to the obsessive compulsive features of this.
Hey guys, it's Ash and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be just talking a little bit more about maladaptive daydreaming, which I've talked about once before on my channel. So, hope you guys enjoy it. This is just going to be things I experience. You don't have to necessarily experience these things just like I do, so, because everyone experiences it differently, so just enjoy learning. And it's raining outside, I hope you can't hear it, So, I found another video on YouTube about this, and I wasn't sure if other people experience this, but then I learned that a lot of other people do. And it's pacing back and forth while maladaptive daydreaming. But I do it while listening to extremely loud music. I have my phone here, by the way. It's kind of like a way to block out everything that isn't my daydream so that I can purely focus on what I'm thinking about, what I'm obsessing about, that scenario. And so I'm not thinking about, like, what's going on in my day. Like, I'm focused only on that one thing. And the pacing and the music kind of helps block out everything else. So, is that a thing other people with maladaptive daydreaming do? Because apparently it is, and I don't know if I do it, like, no doubt, I do it every day. And I know my family think it's weird, and they don't really get it. They're always like, are you doing that to lose weight? I'm like, no. I just can't stop. Next, I wrote, waking up in the middle of the night and not being able to sleep until I come to a stopping point in my daydream. Hey guys, it's Ash.
I'm sorry.
Back to my channel.
So this issue of stopping point,
this happens all the time. You go to a certain point, a stopping point, where it's good to stop. And it's kind of like that, only I need to do it for my daydreams. If I don't stop at the right place, then I won't be able to sleep. I won't be able to continue what I was doing until I stop at the right place. So
this is a description, very clear illustration of the OCD features there, at least in some cases. Okay, so the other issue we need to consider, compare and contrast maladaptive daydreaming from is dissociative identity disorder, because these are individuals who have protagonists in their mind. Often they interact with others talk to them, they can hear and see their internal protagonists. There is some resemblance there. Colin Ross wrote a paper in now defunct clinical journal. Unfortunately, I hope it will be revived. It was a clinical journal of the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation. At any rate, he argued that individuals with a polyfragmented condition, with very elaborate inner worlds, might have some overlap with maladaptive daydreaming. I believe that etiologically, this all starts with, again, the propensity for the ability to restructure perception. So in dissociative disorders, the challenge is to not feel what is being felt, not to experience what has been experienced, not to know what is known, and not to remember what has been coded. So this all of this undoing and compartmentalizing and splitting does not entail necessarily the only the structure of the personality, but can also um, relate to to the consciousness, to the conscious. So again, so people have this ability, which is not pathological in itself, and children who are greatly helped and by this ability because of the adverse circumstances they live in, and they can use it to soothe their emotional pain or to experience comfort and attachment in their minds, would tend to use it uh, more intensely. And this could diverge. This could go into maladaptive daydreaming, but it is could this very same ability, which starts with imaginary friends, even in dissociative identity disorder, many report that it has started with imaginary friends. That then took upon themselves a sense of agency and became part of their own identity. So it's possible that we're talking about the same dissociative capacities, non-pathological in essence, that under duress develop into a main defense mechanism that can later diverge either into dissociative identity disorder or maladaptive daydreaming. This is highly speculative, but these are some initial thoughts. Colin Roston, by the way, wrote another paper that based on studying a cohort of 100 severely abused and dissociative patients in one of his inpatient facilities, and he found a high rate of maladaptive daydreaming among his respondents. So the two are related. They're not identical because, of course, the protagonists in maladaptive daydreaming do not take control over the body. So it's not DID. We have a lot of evidence from qualitative research that we're talking about dissociative disorder, but let me just move quickly because Nomi, I think my time is almost up, isn't it? So I'd like to move to show you some. Okay, so my conclusion based on the extensive research that we've conducted that maladaptive daydreaming is a dissociative disorder. It's a disorder of dissociative absorption, but it has features of a behavioral addiction. And this has, of course, implications to the treatment. But again, we might be able to discuss treatment, but let me show you some drawing artistic expressions of maladaptive daydreaming. There's also a study that Nomi participated in. So this picture represents the recurrent maladaptive daydreaming theme of a compensatory nature. Here, the maladaptive daydreamer is the center of attention and is somebody who craves attention, craves recognition. Here's a respondent that is describing how he feels weighed down. This is a little pale here, but he has a huge head. He's weighed down. The head is sort of tilting in the other direction. His neck is hurting. He's trying to move towards goals, direction, ambition, but his head is sort of pulling him in the other direction. So this is a respondent who talks about the maladaptation. Here is a humoristic representation of maladaptive daydreaming that is experienced as an internal entertainment system. So while other people require electricity to power their entertainment system, so here electricity is on, the person is smiling, watching TV, electricity is off, and the person is upset. While the person himself, who drew it, looks at a TV that is unplugged, but is very happy because he has a TV in his own mind. In this representation of maladaptive daydreaming experiences, the respondent cuts her ties with society and all the values that society represents. Also note that the person feels criticized by society for maladaptive daydreaming, and that it is depicted, the society and societal needs are depicted in monochrome, while the maladaptive daydreaming world, including the maladaptive daydreamer herself, is in colorful and rich colors. Here's a self-representation of a maladaptive daydreamer. This is the bad, and she's here like a sort of stick figure on her bed with earphones on. But you can see the dissociative element of the absorption, how the absorption is sort of isolating her in a bubble from the external world, hobbies, social life, anxieties. These are different people, yes, but you see the recurrent themes. Time ticking, so it's the waste of time, basic vital needs. Some of them don't want to, would rather daydream than sleep, eat, or even have sex. So here she is in her own bubble. And again, note the pictorial differences. The external world is gray, monochrome. The inner world is happy, cheerful, and colorful. So here's another portrayal of the maladaptive daydreaming, a dreamy character immersed in colorful fantasy, where the rabbits don't cease to jump out of the hat. But it's the loss of control over the magic of immersive daydreaming. And finally, the most powerful, I think, illustration of the schism between the fantasy world and the dreary monochrome reality is, again, this recurrent theme. You see this dramatic contrast between the very vivid, colorful description of the fantasy and the dark reality. And the daydreamer seems very happy. She's involved in movement, as you see, and despite the darkness outside, she's very happy because of this inner world. I need some feedback with regard to time, because I can continue, of course, but my clock says that I've been talking close to 1.5 hours. So do we have any questions?
I'm afraid I'm going to have to sort of like wind you up, and maybe we've just got a couple of minutes left for questions. And I just want to say, thank you so much, Ellie. I wish we did have much more time, because I find this whole phenomenon of maladaptive daydreaming incredibly fascinating, and being part of the artwork study. I remember the conversations that you and Leora had about the different pictures and the different things that we were seeing. It was a really wonderful experience to be involved with that. I would like to ask, you've talked about that there are different pathways to maladaptive daydreaming. And so what does that say to us in terms of helping people, in terms of treatment approaches with those different pathways, OCD, ADHD, dissociative disorders? How can we help people who are obviously very distressed by this experience, but also very compelled to stay in those daydreams? And I'm thinking particularly of people with a trauma history, where we know we don't want to take away any sort of like resource they have for coping until they've developed the internal structures to be able to face, as you say, what they don't want to know, what they don't want to see and hear. What can you say about treatment?
Well, we have one case study published already, and we're now finishing the analysis of a randomized clinical trial. So I can say something, fortunately, about treatment. So if you accept my conceptualization of maladaptive daydreaming as a form of a disordered absorption, a dissociative absorption disorder, that has become a behavioral addiction, then we have already from this description we identify two domains of psychopathology. One of them would be behavioral addictions. So not unlike the treatment of other addictions, it is important to teach people to gain better control over their behaviors. But of course, in many cases, addictions are regarded as self-medication. So as you said, before you take away a very powerful coping mechanism that has become a disorder, you need to treat the underlying condition and provide the individual with alternative modes of self-soothing and comforting. So to summarize my answer, I would say we need to borrow elements that have been useful for the improving of control over behavioral addictions like sexual addiction or gambling and other behavioral addictions, identifying the triggers and improving self-monitoring and so on. But that in itself is not enough. That in itself is not enough. And an important element in teaching that we have already demonstrated but not published yet is mindfulness training. Mindfulness has become very popular recently in a variety of treatment protocols. But mindfulness is, of course, so logical an intervention here because people are not mindful to the external reality. They're extremely mindful internally. So we need to teach them how to regulate their attention resources from inside to the outside if they want to be more present. And as is the case with the eating addictions, with eating disorders, you cannot take away, you cannot make people stop eating, and so they need to be able to regulate it better. And as the same is with daydreaming. This is a fantastical gift to have immersive daydreaming, but like the wine appreciation, you need to do it in moderation to know how to savor it, to enjoy it, but you need to be careful not to overdo it. So this is with regard to improving control over the daydreaming. And the other challenge is, of course, to identify what is the purpose and how is it used for example, to imagine oneself in idealized versions of oneself, intimacy, social relationships. These are anger. These are common themes that compensate for missed opportunities and abilities in real life. So that requires traditional psychodynamic psychotherapy, interpersonal psychotherapy to correct these underlying issues that are compensated for in fantasy.
Well, I mean, and all of that just makes perfect sense. I mean, when we think about it being a self-soothing behavior, to find other ways to regulate, to self-soothe, deal with the underlying issues when trauma has been a pathway to it. It's a fascinating phenomenon, Ellie, and I'm so glad that the community found you and really sort of like encouraged you to keep on with your research, because I think that as we saw from the the papers that you showed us and the internet searches, this is a phenomenon that is far more common and widespread than we probably yet understand, and so it's going to be very important for for future in terms of being able to find appropriate ways to help and support people and get the recognition that it clearly needs. So
I agree.
I really want to thank you, Ellie, for joining us today. It's a fascinating subject, as I said, and I would like to just, finish up by saying, I wish you and your family a happy Hanukkah. Only a
Thank you
couple of
very
days
much.
away.
Merry Christmas to all who celebrated.
Yeah, thank you. And to those of you who have tuned in to listen to Ellie today, thank you for joining us. Thank you for supporting this 2020 webinar series that rose out of the global pandemic. I wish you all very relaxing time over the holiday season. Please stay safe, and I look forward to welcoming you online for our next training events in 2021. So until then, stay safe, everyone. See you next time. Thank you, Ellie. Bye.
Bye-bye.